discussions among representatives of all parties in the House, I understand that there is an agreement to observe a moment of silence to commemorate National Indigenous Peoples Day and mark the discovery of the remains of 215 children at a former residential school in Kamloops. Thank you. Merci. Oral questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
After 8 years of this Prime Minister and his anti-building and inflationary policies, housing costs have doubled. In Quebec, in 1 year, average rent increased by 19% in some regions. It went up by 44% in Vancouver. In British Columbia, about 100,000 people could be on the streets because of rent increases. Will the Prime Minister finally inverse his anti-building and inflationist policies that have caused this housing crisis? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. If the Leader of the Opposition were to take this subject seriously, then he would have supported our measures. Our plan seeks to work with municipalities by investing $4 billion, for example, to accelerate approvals for home building, to create 100,000 new homing units, bridging infrastructure investments in housing, helping Canadians to save in order to buy their first house, offering assistance to first home buyers. We continue to be there to help housing. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Takes 25 years for the average Torontonian to save up for the average down payment on a house. Used to be you could pay off the mortgage in 25 years. Now that's what it takes just to get a down payment. After this Prime Minister's anti-construction inflationary policies have doubled the cost of housing. He's done this with deficits that drive up interest rates and drive down salaries, and with funding bureaucracies that block home construction. Will he reverse the policies that caused the housing crisis so that Canadians can put roof overhead?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we had one of the strongest recoveries after the pandemic of all our peer countries, including seeing the creation of about 900,000 new jobs across the country as compared to before the pandemic. Our investments in supporting Canadians have made a real difference and have created growth in the economy. At the same time, we've continued to step up to support families in the construction of new homes, in working collaboratively with municipalities to improve densification, to accelerate zoning changes and permitting, to work to build more housing. The Conservative Leader chooses to pick fights with municipalities. We're going to work collaboratively to get housing.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, he tells Canadians they've never had it so good, but in reality, housing costs have actually doubled under his leadership. In fact, they're among the worst in the world. Vancouver is now the third most overpriced market, and Toronto the 10th. Both are worse than New York City, London, England, and even Singapore, a tiny island. In fact, the average house cost is almost double in Canada than it is in the States, where they have 10 times the people to house on a smaller landmass. His anti-construction inflationary policies are not working. Will he reverse them so that Canadians can get a roof overhead?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we all recognize across this House floor that Canadians are struggling with the cost of housing. The Conservative solution is to cut the programs that are supporting Canadian families, cut the programs that help municipalities invest in accelerating housing, cut the programs that help Canadians save up for a first down payment, cut the programs that are delivering housing solutions for Canadians. We recognize there is more to do, but it doesn't start by cutting the existing programs helping Canadians. We're going to continue to work in partnership with municipalities and help Canadians through these difficult times.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
His $80 billion of programs are not working. They have led to a doubling in the cost of an average down payment, double the necessary monthly mortgage payment, and a 120% increase in the average rent. This is way out of line with what is happening in other countries. Meanwhile, he continues to drive up interest rates on mortgages with his deficits and give money to local bureaucracies to block home building. Will he get off the backs and out of the way of Canadians so that they can finally afford a home?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, not only would the Conservative leader cut programs that are helping Canadians in what is, yes, a difficult housing market, but he's choosing to pick fights with municipalities when we should be working with them, as we are doing, to increase densification, to accelerate permitting, to change zoning, to make sure that we're tying infrastructure investments like transit investments that we're making at record numbers to concentrations of housing and increasing housing stock. We know we need to continue to deliver more housing supply, and we're working with municipalities and provinces to do just.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, he can say all the right things, but he doesn't get anything done. I'll give you a perfect example. I know that he's trying to plagiarize my message on housing, but he can't actually deliver on it. The reality is he brought in a $4 billion housing accelerator fund that has decelerated home building. Home building is actually down 19% versus what it was before he brought in this acceleration program. Right. So instead of just spending money irresponsibly, why won't he tie dollars to houses that are actually complete?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'll certainly accept the compliment that we're saying all the right things, and I'll add to it because we are doing the right things, Mr. Speaker. As we step up with the first-time home buyers tax savings tax-free account, as we work with municipalities to deliver on accelerated housing construction in partnership and the kinds of ways that we get things done, instead of picking fights like the Conservative Conservative leader continues to do. And we will continue to deliver on helping Canadians through these difficult times.
The Honourable Member for Bailleul-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, Northern Quebec is still tackling serious forest fires. The same is true elsewhere in Canada. There are some companies that are suffering. Big companies have the capacity to weather the storm, but small and medium-sized companies are hurting and might have to go bankrupt. We've made proposals to help these companies. I would like to hear if the Prime Minister is ready to sit with us rapidly and to sit with industry in order to rapidly implement urgent programs. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we stand in solidarity with those in Canada and Quebec who have been affected by fires. Safety is our priority. That is why we immediately responded to Quebec's call for aid. We will continue to work together with provinces and territories throughout this difficult period until we come back in September, and we will continue to support forestry sector workers in Quebec and Canada and other sectors that have been affected by forest fires. Through Budget 2023, we've implemented measures with substantive and important investments. Given how little time we have left, I would have to ask the Prime Minister to be a bit more precise. Businesses, and therefore many workers, have a very short-term, acute error, problem that may lead to bankruptcies. Measures have to be quick. To facilitate the process, we took inspiration from measures implemented for SMEs during the pandemic. The model already exists. It could be applied rapidly because the summer isn't over and the situation is serious. Could we act together and now? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we reacted to a pan-Canadian crisis with pan-Canadian tools. In this situation, these are companies in a number of provinces that have been affected, and that is exactly why we are working with the provinces in question. The Quebec government knows full well that Canada will be here as a partner, including through our assistance programs for disasters that they will be able to use. We will be there and we will work with the government of Quebec, and we will all be here to help local companies.
For Nunavut.
This morning, I was honored to attend the raising of the survivors' flag. I thought of Monica Ituksakjak, Ernie Bernhardt, Marilusi Uvilok, and the late Mary Yus Tungilik, and especially my mom, Carmen Idlaut, who survived these horrible institutions. Survivors without intention pass on trauma to the next generations. This government's inaction allows intergenerational trauma to continue. When will this government act to ensure that future generations can live with pride, dignity, and respect?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable member for being there at this important celebration this morning. I was touched to see so many people there as well, because today, June 21st, is a celebration of Indigenous language, culture, as at the same time we recognize the terrible intergenerational traumas and the impacts of residential schools. So it is with mixed feelings that we continue to work together in partnership with Indigenous communities across the country, whether it's on housing, whether it's on health, whether it's on resolving land claims and continuing to support Indigenous leadership. We will continue the path of reconciliation in partnership as we have for the past 7.5 years.
The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
All I heard is empathy. What Indigenous peoples need is action. Brasileiros is still waiting for this government to fulfill their promise to build the mercury poisoning care home in Brasileiros after decades of toxic drinking water. Just like the countless First Nations across this country, they are left waiting for this government to keep a promise they made years ago. Indigenous peoples have heard empty words for decades. Will this government finally deliver the treatment center that Brasileiros desperately needs?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've been working with Indigenous communities right across the country on responding to their needs. The situation in Grassy Narrows that has gone on for far too long is one that we continue to engage in, working closely with local leadership. Moving forwards on giving the kinds of supports necessary. We recognize the scale of the challenges across the country, and we will continue to walk the road of reconciliation in partnership in meaningful, serious ways, as we always have.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister expects to be judged on his promises rather than his results. The results are these. 8 years ago, housing was affordable, taking a modest 40% of average income to pay mortgages on an average house, something that's now up to 60%. Wow. The average cost of a house has nearly doubled. The cost of a mortgage payment has doubled. The cost of monthly rent has doubled. It's double trouble after 8 years of this Prime Minister. Unfortunately, he wants to keep doing what caused the problem in the first place. Will he instead stop funding gatekeeping that blocks construction and bring down the deficits that are driving up mortgage rates?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
It's interesting that the member opposite talks about what happened 8 years ago, because when we formed government, we realized that the previous federal government had done nothing on housing for close to 10 years. They had removed the federal government from any leadership role or partnerships around housing from the which is part of why we've faced real challenges over the past decade in responding to the growth and needs of housing across this country, which is why we also put into place in 2017 a national housing strategy that has led millions of Canadians to get into new residences and refurbished homes across the country, why we've continued to invest and step up.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, his main criticism seems to be that the previous Conservative government didn't hold enough meetings. or spend enough money. What we actually delivered was affordable housing. The average house cost $450,000 at the time. The average rent back then was about 50% of what it is today. And Mr. Speaker, now Canada has the fewest houses per capita in the G7. We have fewer houses per capita than when he took office 8 years ago, at a time when house construction actually dropped off. So will he get out of the way, let Canadians build, and let them put roof overhead?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we all remember well that the previous Conservative government didn't spend enough money investing in Canadians, didn't support our veterans, didn't support builds in infrastructure, cut and slash programs, cut programs for seniors and for youth, raised the retirement age to 67 so that they could balance the budget in a fictional way for an election. Canadians saw through that and had them lose that election, Mr. Speaker. And we've stepped up to continue to invest in Canadians, continue to invest in housing, continue to invest in supports that have seen the economy grow, Mr. Speaker, have seen record job creation and record numbers of people live.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
So he says that his real criticism is that our programs were not expensive enough for taxpayers, Mr. Speaker. The fact is, it's bad enough for him to fail. It's even worse for him to fail expensively, and that's what he's done. He does have an $80 billion housing program that has left us with the fewest houses per capita in the G7, even though we have the most land to build on. Fewer houses per capita than when he took office. We now have almost double the house price in Canada versus the U.S., where they have 10 times the people to house on a smaller landmass. So why doesn't he stop judging himself by how much he can spend instead of judging by how much he can get done?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives consistently get up and say what we really need to grow the economy and help Canadians is cuts. Cuts in the investments we're making for Canadians, cuts in the programs that are helping Canadians afford new homes, cuts in the programs that are incentivizing municipalities to increase density and accelerate house building. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, that proposal of cuts and austerity is exactly why the Conservatives had such an underwhelming night on Monday night in those by-elections, Mr. Speaker. Canadians know they need a government that has their backs. That's what we're doing.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, just because he makes housing more expensive to taxpayers doesn't excuse the fact that he's made it more expensive for home buyers. Right. The reality, I'll give you an example. He tried to plagiarize my message on the need to get housing built by inventing a $4 billion accelerator program. Since that time, housing construction has decelerated. Right. This year, according to his own housing agency, there will be fewer houses built than last year, 19% fewer. So why won't he actually take my policy, which is to link the number of dollars that cities get to the number of houses that get completed?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The $4 billion Housing Accelerator Fund was actually a corner piece of our last election campaign, but apparently the current leader of the official opposition was too busy sharpening his knives to pay attention to our platform in the last election. We've demonstrated a level of commitment and focus on delivering for Canadians while he continues to propose cuts.
I'm just going to... The noise level is starting to go up, and I understand this is like year end for students in a classroom, and everyone's excited. But I'm going to ask everyone to just take a deep breath, and maybe, I mean, the Prime Minister had 10 seconds left if he wants it. It's good? Okay, we'll go over to the Leader of the Opposition, and let's keep everything respectful. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Says there's no room for savings in his sumptuous government spending. Well, I found some. For example, he gave CMHC $26 million in bonuses for making housing less affordable. He paid $181,000 for the Governor General's travel, $116 million for McKinsey, a company that supports him but actually helped cause the opioid crisis, $54 million for the ArriveCan app, $6,000 for one night in a hotel for the Prime Minister. Doesn't he think we could pass on that spending and put the money back in Canadians' pockets?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what the Conservative leader continues to put forward is a program of cutting programs for Canadians, whether it's billions of dollars for childcare at $10 a day right across the country that he continues to campaign against, whether it's investments in a climate action incentive that both puts a price on pollution and puts more money back in the pockets of 8 out of 10 Canadians that he would cancel. That's money in the pockets of families in his riding that he would cancel. Whether it's moving forward on things like a grocery rebate or a doubling of the GST tax credit that has helped out 11 million Canadians and will continue to support seniors and young people.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
So here's a real plan to make housing affordable. Balance the budget to bring down inflation and interest rates on Canadians' mortgages. Require that cities increase the number of permitted homes by 15% in order to get more infrastructure money, and pay the money out once the houses are completed and the keys are indoors. Require every federally funded transit station have high-density housing all around it, and sell off 6,000 underutilized federal buildings to convert them into affordable housing and use the proceeds to reduce the deficit. How's that for a plan?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, many of those elements in his supposed plan are things that we are already very much working on. But the one place we disagree is his proposal to cut programs, to cut supports to low-income Canadians, to cut supports with things like a housing benefit that he not only voted against, but he delayed passage in the House when we were offering a $500 top-up to low-income Canadians. He has consistently stood against the kinds of supports and investments in Canadians, offering instead cuts and austerity at a time where Canadians need continued support. And on fiscal responsibility, Mr. Speaker, we're still at the top of the class in the G7.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Forest fires are the source of the motion on the environment that the Bloc Québécois adopted in this House. The Prime Minister himself supported the motion, which recognises that the federal government must do more to fight climate change. I'd like to remind him of how he voted before we start talking about oil. His government is currently considering whether to authorise Suncor to begin 16 exploratory wells off the coast of Newfoundland. Does the Prime Minister agree that doing more to combat climate change starts with saying no to future oil projects like this one? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we're not approving drilling on Anticosti Island. We're defending our fight against climate change, reducing greenhouse gases, and we continue to be here to recognize that we need oil for a little while longer. This balance has allowed us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the first time in Canadian history. We are reaching our Paris Agreement and Glasgow Agreement targets. We will continue to show leadership and responsibility by creating economic growth for everyone. The Honourable Member for Avignon Métis-Matane-Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, we tabled that motion to end our session on a consensus. We have to do more to make sure that natural disasters don't become a normal thing. We have to make difficult decisions to do so. Everyone knows that the main accelerator of climate change is fossil fuels, but the federal government allows oil companies to continue drilling and exploring. We need to reduce production, but Ottawa is still thinking about increasing production. Can the Prime Minister say that at least new oil projects are coming to an end? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. The imperative thing is to reduce greenhouse gases that lead to climate change, and we have shown our capacity as a government to do so, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that Canada is responsible for, and we continue to do so. We know that the world still needs energy, and that is why we are investing in hydrogen, in nuclear energy, in wind energy, in solar energy, and in many different opportunities to create the energy that the world will need towards net zero Until then, we are still here to try and reduce our gas emissions linked to fossil fuels. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Instead of removing bureaucratic obstacles to allow Quebec to build a greater number of green hydroelectric projects, the Prime Minister and the Bloc want to impose a second carbon tax on Quebecers that will increase the cost of gas by 20 cents per litre. This will also increase the cost of food because farmers and producers will have to pay more for energy in order to produce this food. Instead of harming consumers in Quebec and Canada, why not remove barriers so that Quebec can create even more green electricity? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Once again, the leader of the Conservative bloc, or the Conservatives rather, shows that he knows nothing about what's happening in Quebec. There's no first price on pollution in Quebec from the federal government because they have their own approach. And second of all, in Budget 2023, we've put forward a proposal to give huge tax credits to create green energy in Quebec and throughout the country. This is the kind of thing that will create better opportunities for Quebecers so that they can have a green economy in a net zero world.
Quebecers will have to pay more. For July 1st, the Prime Minister plans to hit Atlantic Canadians with a massive new tax hike at the pump. Happy Canada Day, everyone. The Prime Minister wants you to pay more. Now, the Newfoundland Liberal Premier says that this will do nothing for the environment, but it will make his people go cold in the winter and hungry all year long. Why won't he axe the carbon tax and finally come up with a real environmental plan?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we put a price on pollution, and we are now seeing the emission reductions right across the country. Canada is reaching its targets both for 2030 and towards net zero. That's what we've done by putting a price on pollution. But at the same time as we put a price on pollution right across, ensure the price on pollution right across the country, we are delivering more money back to Canadians in the jurisdictions where the federal backstop is in place. That's more money in the pockets of Atlantic Canadians starting this July as we fight climate change that is having an impact, whether it's on hurricanes or forest fires, that Atlantic Canadians hear too strongly.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
He has not hit a single solitary environmental target with his tax, and Canada ranks 58th out of 64 countries in the Climate Performance Index. His plan is not working. It's just costing more. In fact, the Premier of Newfoundland said that the Prime Minister's claim that we need a tax to save the environment is completely illogical, a false dichotomy, a false dilemma, and it is as insulting as it is simplistic. Right. The unanimous opinion of Atlantic premiers is that this tax will hurt their people without helping the environment. Why won't he axe his plan to raise gas prices by 61 cents a litre?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, while energy companies are making record profits right now across the country, Canadians need support, and that's why we are delivering a climate action incentive that delivers more money every 3 months to Canadians than the price on pollution costs them. And everyone, except apparently the Conservatives, understands that building in price signals on things you don't want, like pollution, is one of the most efficient ways of reducing emissions, of incentivizing behavior, and that's why our emissions are going down and we're hitting our targets, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
He has not hit a single solitary climate target since he brought this tax in, and according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer whom he appointed, in every province in Canada, this tax will cost families more than they get back in these phony rebates. In fact, it will be over $2,000 for the average family per year. The plan is to raise the tax to 61 cents a litre. Canadians cannot afford to eat, heat, and house themselves. So why doesn't he axe the tax so we can bring home lower prices.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader is desperate to demonstrate why not taking action in fighting climate change is the best solution for Canadians. Well, Canadians only have to look out the windows, Mr. Speaker, at wildfires, at atmospheric rivers, at intense hurricanes like Fiona, to know that we have to continue to step up in the fight against climate change. But what we've been able to do is not only return more money with the rebate, including $1,000 a year in the riding of Carleton for the average family of four, but move forward on drawing in investments like Volkswagen, Rio Tinto, Stellantis, and others that continue to invest in growing the economy in Canada. Because
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A CBC report card on the government's progress in implementing the calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls got a failing grade. Only 2 of the 231 calls for justice have been fully implemented to date. Unacceptable. The Liberals must implement all the calls for justice now and put in place a red dress alert system to keep Indigenous women, girls, and diverse gendered folks safe. Yes. Why isn't the Prime Minister acting with urgency in the face of an ongoing genocide?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, our hearts are with survivors and families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people. Addressing this ongoing violence requires living up to our goals as a country and all the calls for justice. We're taking a whole-of-government approach, $125 million to implement the National Action Plan for MMIWG. We've appointed a special rep to consult on the creation of an Indigenous and Human Rights Ombudsperson, $4 billion to support Indigenous housing needs, and we're working to implement a red dress alert. We agree, Mr. Speaker, there's always more to do, but we are taking this seriously and working in partnership with Indigenous peoples right across the country.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Enough with the platitudes, Mr. Speaker. We need action now. This Prime Minister acknowledged this as an ongoing genocide. This House unanimously recognized the violence against Indigenous women, girls, and diverse gendered folks as a Canada-wide emergency. And almost 4 years since the National Inquiry, only 2 calls to justice have been addressed. When will the Prime Minister implement the red dress alert and the remaining calls to justice? We are a target. Our lives are on the line. Our lives matter, Mr. Speaker.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I understand how much more there is to do, but to dismiss $4 billion in housing investments for Indigenous people as platitudes is not doing justice to the incredible Indigenous leaders that are working across the country to deliver for their citizens in partnership with the federal government. It is to dismiss the hard work Indigenous leaders are doing to create more housing, to create more safe spaces, to create shelters. $100 million to create 22 new Indigenous shelters and transitional homes are not platitudes, Mr. Speaker. We are working seriously, and we look forward to continuing to work with all members in this House on reconciliation.
L'Honourable député de Château.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle.
On Monday, Canadians clearly rejected the Conservative Party's failed approach under their new leadership and instead opted in favour of delivering real results for Canadians today and for generations to come. Whether in Quebec, the Prairies, or southwestern Ontario, we see Canadians supporting this Liberal government's approach to creating jobs and creating and ensuring a clean, growing economy of the future. Can the Prime Minister inform the constituents?
I'm sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt.
I didn't hear any questions.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle from the top, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can bring it home. Mr. Speaker! Home! On Monday, Canadians clearly rejected the Conservative Party's failed approach under their new leadership and instead opted in favour of delivering real results for Canadians today and for generations to come. Whether in Quebec, the Prairies, or southwestern Ontario, we see Canadians supporting this Liberal government's approach to creating jobs and ensuring a clean, growing economy of the future. Can the Prime Minister inform the constituents of NDG Westmount and Winnipeg South Centre what their new Liberal members of Parliament will fight for?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie la députée de Châteauguay.
I thank the honourable member for Châteauguay-Lacolle for her question and for her hard work. I want to congratulate all the candidates for the recent by-election and welcome Anna Gainey and Ben Carr.
They're not even members. They're not even sworn in yet. Order. The Right Honourable Prime Minister from the top, please.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie la députée de Châteauguay.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for Châteauguay-Lacolle for her question and for her hard work. I'd like to congratulate all of the recent by-election candidates and welcome Anna Gainey and Ben Carr to this House.
Ontario, Manitoba had a choice between the Conservative Party's divisive rhetoric, austerity, and cuts, or our plan to continue to strengthen the middle class, make life more affordable, fight climate change, and so much more. Now, there's a lot more hard work left ahead of us, and our team will be even stronger with these two new strong voices in Ottawa.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président, les augmentations.
Mr. Speaker, the extreme increase of interest rates is unprecedented. It was caused by the inflationary deficits of this government. Canadians are worried about losing their homes. According to the Bank of Canada, the average Canadian can expect a 40% increase in mortgage payments. And the International Monetary Fund says that Canada is the most at risk for a bankruptcy crisis. Will this government commit to reducing these inflationary deficits and allow Canadians to enjoy better economic circumstances that will let them keep their homes? We have the lowest deficit in the G7. We have the best GDP to debt ratio, and we have a AAA credit rating. According to credit agencies around the world, we have a fiscally responsible approach to protect our economy and generate growth. At the same time, we're investing to support low-income Canadians and help people buy a new home, as well as invest with municipalities to create more housing and generate more construction of new housing. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
This Prime Minister, it now takes well over 60% of a family's pre-tax income to make monthly payments on an average house. That's mathematically impossible, but possibly about to get worse. The Prime Minister's inflationary deficits are driving up interest rates faster than at any time since any of us have been alive. This means that Canadians could face 40% increases in their monthly payments. There may be another bank rate increase this summer that will push Canadians to bankruptcy. Before the Canadians lose their homes, will he get rid of his inflationary deficits to bring down those terrible mortgage rates?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has the lowest deficits in the G7. We have the best debt to GDP ratio, the lowest one in the G7 as well. And we are one of the three largest economies in the world, along with Germany and the United States, to have a AAA credit rating from the bond rating agencies. Our fiscal plan is sustainable even as we continue to invest to support low-income Canadians, to support municipalities in building more housing, to move forward in a plan while the Conservative Party once again continues to talk about cuts in programs, cuts in services, cuts for Canadians.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Canada has the worst household debt in the G7, by far the worst, and that debt risks blowing up when rates rise. Now, Mr. Speaker, one of the ways the Prime Minister has been wasting money is he gave $210 million to the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which is controlled by Beijing and designed to build the infrastructure of Beijing's communist empire throughout Asia. We warned him 5 years ago, and now some of that bank's own executives are speaking out against it. He claims he's stalling his involvement in the bank, but the real question is, when will we get our $200 million back?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Canada has long been involved in investing in infrastructure around the world because we know that it creates growth and opportunity in the global south. It continues to contribute to fighting climate change as people are building more resilient infrastructure and indeed in energy infrastructure. And we are part of multilateral development banks all around the world. But as the Leader of the Opposition pointed out, we are reviewing our participation in the Asian Infrastructure Bank, and we'll make the decision that's right for Canadians.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
So he's defending the $200 million he gave to a bank one of whose executives said, and I quote, "I didn't find a single tangible benefit to communicate back home here to Canada of what this bank does that is consistent with our values in a way that would benefit Canadians." That the Prime Minister, while Canadians are starving and can't heat their homes, he's forcing them to give $200 million to this bank, controlled by Beijing, to expand a communist empire in Asia. Mr. Speaker, when will Canadians get their $200 million back from this liberal-friendly bank?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
As I said, we are evaluating our continued participation in this multilateral development bank controlled by Beijing. We continue to look very, very carefully at how we're having a positive impact around the world with investments in infrastructure and how we're delivering for Canadians in the fight against climate change, in growth around the world that benefits Canadians, and in participation in supports for the Global South.
L'honorable député de Trois-Rivières.
The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, sessional review of federal politics observers are identical. The story of this session is about the 4 months wasted by the Liberals trying to avoid a commission of inquiry into Chinese interference. This waste of time is what everyone's remembering because of this government's obstinacy in continuing to defy the will of the people in the House. Mr. Speaker, it is more than time to move on to the next step. The government says that it's being open and the Bloc Québécois is cooperating. Will the Prime Minister finally announce a public and independent commission of inquiry into foreign interference? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the fight against foreign interference in our democratic institutions is a nonpartisan issue. The Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs talked to leaders of the opposition considering the next steps and is establishing a consensus that will lead to a nonpartisan process, and we will move forward together.
Honorable député de Laurentides-Labette.
The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labette.
Tout est pourtant déjà en place pour qu'on puisse passer.
And yet, Mr. Speaker, everything's in place to proceed. The Bloc Québécois is cooperating. The Prime Minister knows he can count on the NDP to do whatever they want to do. The public is behind us. The Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs is holding constructive discussions with the opposition, which we welcome. If the Prime Minister does indeed intend to launch a commission of inquiry, the stars will never align any better. Will he finally announce this inquiry so that it can finally get to work and so that we can all finally move on to the next caller? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Work is ongoing in order to counter foreign interference. NSICOP, NSIRI, and other institutions, we want to work with opposition parties. I thank them for the cooperation we have observed. Canadians know full well that we need a process that's not going to lead to toxic partisan attacks, as we saw before. We are coordinating with other parties to set something up that will work and take it seriously. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Admitted, and I quote, that the Asian Infrastructure Bank is controlled by Beijing. He says he's not going to get our money back. He's just going to review our participation. While Canadians can't afford to eat, heat, or house themselves, he's forcing them to give almost $250 million to this Beijing-backed bank. So once again, je pose la question, est-ce que le...
I ask the question once more. Will the Prime Minister get our money back from this bank, which he admits is controlled by Beijing? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our commitment to the construction of infrastructure throughout the world, especially in emerging countries in the South, means that we make investments for roads, for power plants, and for other projects in the South. We will continue to do so. We are reassessing our participation in the Asian Investment Bank, and we're going to share our conclusions with Canadians when we conclude our assessment. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. On the question of foreign interference in our democracy, I've already talked to this Prime Minister about the Conservative Party's support. We're ready to provide names and mandates as soon as the Prime Minister announces that a public inquiry starts. They want to set up a call with opposition parties tomorrow. Will, finally, the Prime Minister announce a public inquiry into Beijing's interference so that we can protect our democracy before we hold more elections? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I recognize that opposition parties are now ready to work together to establish a process that will work well. You will understand that, having seen how opposition parties behaved in the last months, in the face of a former Governor General, we want to make sure that everyone agrees on the framework, the people who will participate, and we don't want to fall back into personal attacks, which will undermine Canadians' confidence in their institutions. The Leader of the Opposition.
Prime Minister jetted off to New York for a weekend with celebrities, and now we know the price tag. While Canadians can't eat, heat, or house themselves, he stuck them with a $61,000 bill just for the hotels of himself and his entourage. One weekend, $61,000 of fun. Mr. Speaker, Canadians cannot pay their own bills. They certainly can't afford to pay his. Will he commit to paying for his own vacations this summer?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to be in New York to meet with Ursula von der Leyen, Mia Mottley, to engage in important conversations about the future of our economy, of the fight against climate change. These are things that matter. It was a midweek trip, and I actually happen to know that former Prime Minister Harper was also attending meetings at the same time we were down there with the same organization. These are things that matter in terms of Canada's leadership in the world. It matters in terms of outcomes for Canadians. We will continue to do the work that Canadians expect of this government to lead on the global stage.
The Honourable Member for Kings Hants.
Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the Conservative Party no longer resembles those led by Joe Clark, Brian Mulroney, or even Stephen Harper. The Leader of the official opposition is taking the Conservatives into the ditch on the far right to outflank Max Bernier by spewing conspiracy theories about the World Economic Forum, supporting candidates against reproductive rights and promoting hate against LGBTQ+ communities. It's the same playbook we've seen in the United States. Can the Prime Minister reassure my constituents, including those who identify as progressive Conservatives, that our Liberal government is the best vehicle to drive Canada forward?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to double check on that. Does not qualify as a question. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order. 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 The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Public Safety Minister has presided over a 32% increase in violent crime under this government. The Public Safety Minister misled hunters when he planned to ban their rifles. The Public Safety Minister sat on information about the transfer of one of Canada's most notorious killers to have more freedom and comfort by getting him out of maximum security prison when he could have passed a law to prevent it. Will the Prime Minister commit today to firing his incompetent public safety?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Leader leader talks about freedom, but he's all talk, no walk on freedom when he handpicks candidates who want to take away Canada's freedoms. So let me be very clear. In Canada, everyone has the freedom to love whom they love. Everyone has the freedom to choose what they do with their own bodies with safe access to abortion. And
I'm sorry, it's starting to get noisy in here again, and we're getting close to the end, and I'm wondering whether I start bouncing around with whatever's left. But look, I think everybody's excited to get out of here, and I understand that. So let's start again from the top, and I want everyone to just take a deep breath and listen to each other. Listen to the question and listen to the answers. The Right Honourable Prime Minister, from the top, please.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader is all talk, no walk when it comes to freedom, when he handpicks his candidates who want to take away Canadians' freedoms. So let me be very clear. In Canada, everyone has the freedom to love whom they love. Everyone has the freedom to choose what they do with their own bodies with safe access to abortion. And everyone has the freedom to move safely in their communities without damaging blockades. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, and in our candidates, we will always stand up for Canadians' freedoms.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The only thing he has done is free Paul Bernardo from a maximum security penitentiary into relative freedom in a place where he can have access to other people, where he has more comforts and more can put guards in danger. Now, the Prime Minister interfered with Corrections Canada's decisions by introducing Bill C-83 that allowed this kind of transfer to go ahead. The Minister of Public Safety knew the transfer, his office knew at least, for 3 months while he claimed that they couldn't walk down the hallway and tell him. He is incompetent. Will the Prime Minister fire him, yes or no?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we know how difficult this decision is for families of the victims. We share the deep concerns that Canadians have been expressing. The decision to transfer incarcerated persons is an independent decision made by the Correctional Services of Canada. Following outreach by the Minister of Public Safety, the Commission ordered an additional review that is underway and will be completed soon.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
So the minister can actually order reviews, which means he can also issue directives to ensure that all mass murderers are kept in maximum security penitentiaries. He could also adopt our law today, which would require that every mass murderer stay in a maximum security penitentiary. That would be an apolitical way to solve the problem, but they haven't done that, even though the minister knew about this problem, or ought to have known, 3 months ago. So can the Prime Minister confirm, will this public safety minister still have that job when we come back here in the fall?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, being there and supporting victims is always top of mind for this government. After learning of the transfer, the minister was in touch with the commissioner, and the commissioner has now ordered an additional review that is now underway and will be completed soon.
The Honourable Member for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Speaker, today on National Indigenous Peoples Day, we recognize and celebrate the important contributions of Indigenous people to our country, as well as the diverse culture, language, and heritage of Indigenous peoples. In my riding, I think of the work of the Lil'wat Nation to restore language through their education programs, the Sechelt Nation becoming the first self-governing nation in Canada and obtaining justice for day scholars, and the transformative developments of the Squamish Nation with the Sanok housing development in a way that highlights their heritage. While much work has been done on the road to reconciliation, much remains to do together. Can the Prime Minister please update this House on the forthcoming release of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Action Plan?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country for his question and his hard work. Today, on National Indigenous Peoples Day, we released our action plan to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, developed in partnership with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. The Conservative leader voted against that bill and associated himself with those who deny the realities of residential schools. Mr. Speaker, Canada cannot go backwards. We must always choose to confront the truth and strive to right these wrongs.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Griesbach.
In Edmonton, 58% of those currently houseless identify as Indigenous. Under the Liberal government, Indigenous people are now 11 times more likely to use a shelter or live in inadequate homes than non-Indigenous people. New Democrats have been calling on this government to address the housing crisis First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities have had to deal with. So when will this government finally start to invest properly in a for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing strategy so that everyone can live with safety and dignity?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The answer is when? In Budget 2023, that's exactly what we did. We committed to working with Indigenous peoples to co-develop an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. Budget 2023 includes an additional investment of $4 billion in this Indigenous housing strategy, on top of the $6.7 billion since 2015. Housing remains a top priority as part of reconciliation, and we will continue to work with partners on this right.
The Honourable Member for Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, Canada Day is quickly approaching, and to celebrate, the Liberal government is giving the gift to Canadians of another tax, the Clean Fuel Regulation. But the only thing being cleaned are Canadians' pocketbooks, as independent analysis has found that it actually increases net greenhouse gas emissions, and this time with no rebate. Thanks to the NDP, British Columbia already has one in place, which is costing British Columbians 17 cents per litre. Can the Prime Minister share with Canadians how much the rest of the country will have to pay for his overspending and for his latest tax grab?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Canadians have seen across the country, whether it was Hurricane Fiona on the East Coast, whether it's forest fires raging across the country with greater intensity than previous years, or whether it's the atmospheric river BC was hit with just a few years ago, the cost of inaction on climate change would be cataclysmic. That's why we put forward a price on pollution that is bringing down our emissions and going to allow us to reach our targets at the same time as we put more money back in the pockets of Canadians with the climate action incentive 4 times a year. Mr. Speaker, we are supporting Canadians while we fight climate change.
This is all the time we have for question period today. C'est tout. We're going to come. We'll come to the point of orders in a moment. I have a list of point of orders, so we've put them all on the list. We see you out there. But first, following discussions among representatives for all parties in the House, I understand that there's an agreement to observe a moment of silence to honour the Royal Canadian Air Force members who were injured and lost their lives near Petawawa. J'invite les honorables députés de se lever.
I invite honourable members to stand.
Merci. Thank you. We have a point of order. I believe the government